And welcome, you guys. I'm sitting here with a very important guest. All of our guests are important, but they all bring something different to the table. And what our guest tonight is bringing to the table is very different in terms of its applicability to our viewing audience today and our viewing audience in the future. Because our guest brings a perspective and an experience that is atypical from our regular guests. Our regular guests are often people who left Mormonism because of, you might say, sin or habits or difficulties, addictions. They didn't come from the higher echelons of the faith. And our guest tonight, I'm going to let her explain her whole life as we do, comes from a different echelon of life, of believers, and of Mormon, really. And that's important because it takes a certain amount of courage. It takes a different kind of courage to be able to come and step forward and talk like this. And those of you who are from that know that. And so I hope that you will give time and attention to what Iilona has to say. This is our guest, Iilona Nielson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Taking the time. And for your courage. And for your husband Shane's support. He's sitting on the front row. And I just want to, it's not something to say on a show. I just really am grateful that you're willing. This is not easy for people, for everybody especially. So what I would like to do, if it's okay, is to start with a prayer.
Sure.
All right. She says I can. Let's do it. Lord, come to you and we pray that those who are participating in this production, Iilona and myself and Seth and Wendy, post-production, what goes on there, and then those who watch live in the archives and in the future, that the message that will go out will be meaningful and applicable to the right people. That's what we care about. It certainly won't be applicable and agreed upon, Lord, by everybody, because everybody comes from a different place. But there are people, important people, Ilona's family and friends and people she loves dearly that may hear this, and then others who can relate to what she has to say. I pray your spirit will be with her. She'll be able to relax and communicate the contents of her heart, and we'll be able to put together some realities and truth that will transcend this world and reach into the hearts and minds of those who are seeking you and seeking truth. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So as we often do, I just like to take our guests and turn it over. We want to start with all about you. And if you want to talk about grandma and grandpa and mom and dad, that would really be good.
Yeah.
Siblings, take it away.
Okay, so maybe before I even talk about those people, I'd just like to explain my geographical background, where I came from, because it's very different to here. So I was born in Northern Ireland. Most Americans that I speak to don't really understand that Ireland's basically two countries. So I kind of got tired explaining it in the beginning. So then I just kind of went with people calling me Irish, even though that thought never even crossed my mind till I came to America.
Wait, so I have to stop right there. So not Irish, then what would they call you? Northern Irish? British?
Right.
Really?
Yes.
We've already learned something. We got about 5 people in here, males. They're like, whoa. So British.
Yeah. Okay.
Explain why.
So basically you had the island of Ireland. It was made up of 36 counties. And in the 17th century, the British Crown, Londoners, they came to the north of Ireland, and they wanted to take the land off the Irish landowners and populate it with the Scotch and with the English. So they sent people over, started to do that. Of course, the Irish didn't like it because they were like, this is our land, what are you doing here? And that was really the start of the conflict that most Americans are familiar with. So they did gain possession of the top 6 counties. So 6 counties belonged to the British, and then the lower 30 counties are the Republic of Ireland. So I would have grown up, I went to British school, it was British government, British money, British healthcare system. And then the Republic, they would have had different currency, different government. So
That is just amazing.
Yeah.
So, having established that, would you say that the British of Northern Ireland are maybe looked down on the Southern as perhaps not as educated or perhaps not as...
Do I think that Northern Ireland looked down on Southern Ireland?
Yeah.
I think, yes.
I like how it took a minute. I think that, yes.
Well, so it's complex. So the town that I grew up in was a border town, meaning that it was on the border of North and South Ireland. And in our town, even its very name, so before it was invaded by the Crown, the name of the city was Derry, which came from a Gaelic word meaning oak grove, meaning dwar. So when the Crown sent these men over to take over the land, these men were from London, so they put the word London in front of Derry. So the city really has two names. The Catholics refer to it as Derry and the Protestants refer to it as Londonderry. Huh. So the city has a river Foyle that runs down the centre of it. And essentially the Catholics live on one side and the Protestants live on the other. Huh. So that's kind of what I was kind of born into. So very, very, very different to here.
Wow. Very different.
Yeah. And my family, like the names, the surnames that my family came from, like we would have come from England and Scotland, like we would have been part of that group.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And at the time, the people were not allowed to practice their religion. So the Scotch kind of went underground and they were forced west towards Northern Ireland. They practiced Christianity kind of in their houses and secret meetings. And then eventually when the immigration boats came along, then they hopped on those. And one of the main ports was in my city. And then they came across to America.
Fantastic. Well, that is fantastic background.
Yes, so that's...
For where you came from. So then, did you do genealogy as a Latter-day Saint? Or did you benefit from them doing genealogy?
No, I didn't do it personally. My dad was massively into it. I just had the guilt of I needed to do this, but I had no time. You know what I mean? It was always like that to-do, that massive never-ending list that sat back here and nagged at you. So.
Okay, so how did your family, mom and dad, arrive through grandparents or great-grandparents? So
we'll start with my mom's parents. So we go back to World War II, and she was the eldest of six. My grandfather went off for 6 years to the Second World War.
Wow.
And my grandparents, my mother's parents, actually were the first members of the Mormon Church. I'm going to call it Londonderry because in my childhood, I called it Londonderry, and then when I was an adult and I went back, I called it Derry. So I kind of refer to it as wherever I was in my timeline. So they actually were met by the Mormon missionaries, and they were the first members to join in our city, my mother's parents.
Amazing. Mm-hmm. What heritage.
So, oh yeah, but it gets better. So that was kind of that. She was raised in this family. He was back and forth. So the Second World War was 1939 to 1945. So he was back and forth. My mom was the eldest of these kids. My father, his situation was a little bit different. Again, World War II time. He found himself in a situation where he was raised by his grandmother and grandfather. And then when he was 8 years old, he looked out the window one day and he saw this black horse and this black carriage, and his grandmother had died and they were taking her body off. So from the time he was 8, he was essentially raised by his grandfather. So just, I think hard times too, because they would have been very young, and then after the war, you know, things weren't great. So
dad's side, what religious persuasion was grandma before she died and grandpa?
So they would have been, so there's obviously different like variations of Presbyterianism, but I would have said, I think maybe Church of Ireland.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how did those two meet?
So my mum's family were Presbyterian, very much I don't like stereotypes because I think it's a lazy way to get to know people, but the Presbyterians were very neat and orderly, and everything was about parents, you know, very much that way. So my my parents did live on opposite sides of the river, and my mum, there were bridges that went over the river, and my mum had spotted him and she thought he was handsome. So she had a friend that knew him, and my mum offered her friend money to introduce them, like a little bribe, you know. She wouldn't have had much money, but she's like, let's go walking and I'll pay you if you introduce me to this guy. So they were introduced, and at the time there wouldn't have been TV or anything, so that's what the young people did in the evenings, is they walked the bridges. So that's kind of how they socialized. So they got to be introduced, they got to meet, and then that's how they dated, is they just would walk along the bridges, and in the evenings he would walk her home, and then he would walk across the bridge back home, and then he would just like flash his lights 3 times in his house, and the light would come across the river to let her know he was safe, you know.
Wow.
So
don't you wish romances with our kids were like that now? More walking.
Yeah.
More walking.
Yeah.
So mom and dad meet that way. When did they marry?
So the Mormon missionaries arrived in Londonderry in 1957, and people are often surprised about, you know, how early Mormons were in Ireland, but John Taylor first went there in 1840, so that there was some influence long before that. And the missionaries came, they talked to my mother's parents, they joined, and I believe some of her siblings, I don't know how many. I talked to my parents, and it was 3 months before they were getting married. So they said, you know what, we're kind of busy, let us get married and then come back and see us. So that's exactly what happened.
So was it in the late 50s then that mom and dad both joined the church?
Yeah.
But they were married prior?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And were they married in any kind of religious institution? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, I mean, I know the name of the church. I'm pretty sure it was Church of Ireland, but just Presbyterian, we'll go with that.
And was there any sort of, I'm just curious for background, animus from mom and dad toward Catholics?
No.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. Because my father's mother, she didn't raise him, but she went on and married someone else, and he was a Catholic. And so my grandmother on that side, the word that they use in Ireland, I don't know if it's very PC. The word is turned, so that's when you turn your religion. So she turned from Protestant to Catholic because usually in the Catholic Church, they have to both agree to raise the children that way. So my dad's siblings then would have all been raised Catholic, so there was no animosity that way.
So mom and dad, what was the socioeconomic status? What did dad do? Did mom work outside the home? What was the home life prior as kids start to come in?
So they didn't have kids right away. I'm going to back up just a wee bit. So when they first got married, they lived with my father's grandmother in a little loft, a little attic that she had. And when the missionaries started coming around, she did not like it because they'd hear technology was different and there wasn't as much communication, but there were enough rumors and rumblings that there were stories about polygamy and Mormons and all of this kind of stuff. So my father's grandmother said, if you join this Mormon church, you can't live here anymore. So she basically put them out on the street because they decided to join the church. So it wasn't a great start. So they tried to have kids for like 5 years. And when we were all younger, my mom stayed at home. They weren't able to have kids, so they adopted my first brother. And then, of course, as soon as he came, other kids came along. So my dad, when they were all younger, he had an insurance company. My mom stayed at home. And then down the road, that changed a little bit. When I got into secondary school, she did go out to work then, but she would have been home when I was a child.
I see.
Yeah.
So your mom and dad, insurance company, your mom is with the kids.
Yeah.
Prototypical kind of LDS household, really. In that the wife is home, the husband's working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then because my dad was raised by his grandfather, he was raised by a man who was born in like the 1890s. So very much like very old school kind of mentality, very much the man does this A, B, and C job, and the woman does this, and the roles there wasn't much crossover, you know?
Okay. All right, so then moving on, you're ultimately born into a family of how many kids, and where are you in the order? We have an adopted older brother.
So so I've adopted older brother. Then within a year there was another boy, and then within another year there was another boy. So she went from not being told to have no kids to having 3 children, 2 and under. So she was kind of swamped, and yeah, she was super busy. And then they kind of all got bigger, and so they were 12, 11, and 10, and then I was born. So 3 very much older brothers, big gap, and then me.
And then you're the caboose. Okay. So 3 males, dad, mom, and little Iilona in the house. And mom and dad, how faithful are they?
Let me just give this as an example. So back then, when they were, so now there were 8 original members of the church in Londonderry, and my parents were 2 of them. And when they were constructing buildings, it's not like now that the building just kind of pops up. The members had to come up with 30% of the construction costs and the labor. Well, that just wasn't feasible when you're looking at that few people for them to come up with the finances. So they, in their home, they were like in a small 3-bedroom house. So they had my family, this is before I was born, with my 3 brothers. And then they had what was called labor missionaries from England would come over, and my mother kept them at our home and fed them and provided for them. And I can't remember, I think it was about 5 years it took. So my dad would go to work all day, come home, get his dinner, and go straight out and work at the church all evening. So my mom essentially did the lion's share of the raising the kids, kind of on her own.
Wow.
So by the time the building was actually finished, they had gone from a membership of 8 people to 3 people because it was too heavy of a burden. There was my mom and dad, and then one other lady who's still there. So when you talk about investment, there aren't too many people who would go to work all day, come home, have a quick bite to eat, and go out to bedtime, and do that for 5 years. My dad was the branch president for 32 years.
Yikes.
I know. It wasn't consecutive, it was like in chunks, but or like cumulative, sorry, but all together it was 32 years. So when you talk about commitment, I don't know how they could have committed much more.
So it seems to me, listening to what you've said, is that we have a history of religion in your country, there being odds. We have the Mormon missionaries coming in to the point that your mom and dad said, if you join that church, you're out. So we have suffering for the cause.
Yes.
Then we have, as a family member, you have your dad, your mom bearing the home, and your dad going to work, and then going in for 5 years. So we have pioneer-like dedication to the church, and you come into this family. I just want to jump ahead for a second. Your 3 brothers, are they all still LDS?
My 3 brothers they were all assistants to presidents on their missions, all-star seminary scripture masteries, bishops several times. Yeah.
That's your way of saying yes.
Was this 4 hours? I don't know. Maybe I got the wrong memo. But I'm kind of showing you like the caliber of the expectation that was in our home. Like it was no little thing to be a member of our family. Like you were expected to be.
So your brothers were assistants and everything else. How about you? Growing up. What's going on with little Iilona with 3 much older brothers, mom and dad, dedication to the church?
So I guess I didn't realize this until recently. I started my one brother's wife suddenly passed away unexpectedly a year or so ago, and my brother and I started going on walks and we started talking. And when we did that, this is the one that's 12 years older than me, I came to the conclusion really quickly that we were raised by the same parents, but we were raised very, very differently. So by the time I was 6 years old, my brothers had all left home. So I was kind of like an only child from that point on. One went to Sweden to play soccer. One went to America to live with my aunt and just kind of have like a, I don't know, like a study abroad kind of a thing. And then one ended up going on a mission, the oldest one. So they were all gone by the time I was 6.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are mom and dad still alive?
Right now, just my mom.
Just your mom. So what's happening with you? What is life about in Londonderry as a 6-year-old, alone in the house, like an only child with mom and dad growing up?
So we live 7 miles out of the city. So then it was kind of considered the countryside. I went to a little country school. It was very nice, very pleasant, very safe, very idyllic. I was kind of shy. Liked to play a lot. Like I would come home from school, go out to play, wouldn't come home to eat because if somebody saw me, I might not get back out to play. Like I just loved to be out. Roller skating, cycling, just being outside.
The whole thing?
Yeah.
And the church, fundamental to life? Primary?
Yeah, I don't have any memory until I had a couple of children myself of my father ever sitting with our family. Like my dad was always up on the stand.
Wow.
So, and he would go to church and then it was meetings after church. And so that was just normal, you know, there wasn't, that was just kind of normal.
And did you think that you didn't have any growing up at that time, any sort of resistance to that didn't bother you? You didn't say, Dad, how come you're never with us? A lot of people have that. They get angry, but it sounds like to you it was normal.
Yeah, it didn't bother me.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just normal. Yeah, it didn't bother me.
And the branch, it went from going down to 3 people. Did it grow?
Yeah, I mean, the church in Europe never really has flourished. It's always kind of been a struggle. So yeah, I mean, it grew, but a lot of the growth was kind of our family. Like then I had like my dad's brother and or family friends. My dad was hugely influential in really anybody that came into the church, you know, was kind of either an associate, most everyone of my dad, or a family member. So
he was, because he was so young into it, so dedicated, anything that happened almost, he was involved.
Oh yeah.
And if you go back there now, are all those roots still bearing the fruit of you are little Iilona, whose parents were...
Well, like when you look, so if my dad wasn't the branch president, it was my uncle, or then it would have been my brother, and then back to my dad, and then my husband, and then my, you know, it just kind of, when it was always, there was always really some connection to my dad, you know.
That's a lot. And the reason I'm kind of staying on this is because I know Iilona's story a little bit.
Yeah.
And this plays a huge role in what this family's going to go through in the future, which we'll get to.
Okay.
So how about then when you became of age, did they have normal programs, mutual activity night at the branch?
Yeah, I remember my brothers talking about MIA, but I was too young, you know.
Yeah, I remember MIA.
They had MIA, had a changed young men, young women. My dad had been the seminary teacher for my brothers. He wasn't my seminary teacher, so we had at-home seminary, like study, and then once a week you would go like to the teacher's house. I do remember being really young, having primary, not in the 3-hour block, but going to somebody else's house.
Oh, wow.
A long time ago. So I do have one story I want to tell you about when I was 8 years of age at church.
Let's hear it.
So most of our members came from the Presbyterian or the Protestant side of the city, and our church was in the Catholic side, and the Catholic side was really where where you would say the terrorists lived, like the IRA terrorists, and they obviously were still bad feeling, I mean, even still today, because the British had taken their land. So they had said that they did not want to really kill any civilians, but if civilians were caught up in anything that happened, it was kind of just, so be it. But their goal was basically, they said that anybody who was involved in either the police or the army and any kind of military was not safe. And they really wanted to destroy basically buildings and structures as just basically kind of nipping at the British heels, you know. So when I was 8 years of age, one Sunday we were in Sacrament, and the bread and water had just been passed, and there was a lady in our branch who was a nurse, and she needed to leave early to go and take her shift at the hospital. But her father was retired Army, so obviously that would have been a threat. So as soon as the bread and water were finished, she exited out the back of the building, obviously before the meeting was supposed to be over. And as she went out the back, she saw 2 paramilitaries underneath her father's car attaching a device, a bomb.
Wow.
So she comes back in, and I remember her going up to the front to the stand, because like nobody goes up, like what is this? Everybody's like, what is happening? And she said, there's they're attaching a device to the back of underneath the car. So I remember we all were quickly put out of the building, and the police were called, and they put us across the street. So now we're kind of looking at the church, looking at the front of the church, and the activity was going on in the back. And I remember standing there, and my mother was the Premier President, of course, and there was a child that couldn't be accounted for. And we were all we felt safe across the street, and she went back into the building to do a search for this child. And I remember being so cross, like so ticked off. I'm like, this building could blow up at any second, and my mother's in there. And I was like, well, where's the mother of the child that's right? And just the fear of this, she could just go. And so when you talk about committed, those are the parents that I had. Wow. Like, you know, it's hard to kind of quantify, but just constantly trying to do their best, what they thought was their best. No cost was too high, no suffering was too much, just wanted to always be that person. And so what I didn't know until years later, but the church was kind of there, the bomb was at the back, we were standing across the street, there were a row of houses behind us, and intelligence had been called into the bomb squad when they were on their way across the bridge to come and detonate the bomb. And in this row of houses behind us, there were snipers.
Wow.
And what their plan was is when the police arrived at the church, or the army disposal unit, that the snipers were going to go off, and it was just going to be a bloodbath. So the police got word that the snipers were in the building. They turned around on the bridge and went home and left us there on our own. Like, they didn't, it was hours later before they came. So, yeah, totally dedicated family. And as a child growing up, I started remembering maybe around 9 and 10 and 11. You know, before that, you're not really aware of things, but when the phone would go, we often had what was called bomb scares. It was just a normal part of life. And the phone would go, and it would be the police, and they'd say, there's been called in, there's a bomb at the church. This would be like maybe on a Tuesday morning or a Wednesday out. It would be any time, not when people were in the building. And the police did not want to go in and look for the bomb. So I remember my dad would say, right, boys, let's go. And he would take my 3 brothers, and me and my mum would stay at home. And because my dad had the keys to the church, and they would arrive over at the church, and so now you have the British Army behind my dad, and they all have like their bulletproof vests, and they're all kind of protected, if you like. My dad and these 3 little boys, well, they're not little boys, they're kind of a little bit bigger, but still, they're vulnerable. They would arrive at the church. My dad's like trying to get the key open. The boys are there. My dad says then the army was behind him, and they would just like push him in, and they would go in to do like searches for bombs. Like, they could have been blown up at any second. And this happened fairly regularly. They did actually find bombs that were stored in, you know, like those metal like manholes. Yeah, things like that.
Wow.
So because of where the church was located, it was easy for things to be stored. So one day, am I talking too much? Okay.
No.
So one day, my dad was in his car, and he came up to a roundabout, And he saw this guy that used to be a member of the congregation and who would no longer come to church. And my dad stopped him and he said, "Why do you not come back to church?" And the guy said, "I can't, I'm in too deep." And my dad says, "Well, could you arrange a meeting with me with the highest person that was in charge of the IRA that was in our city?" He said, "I want to talk to him." So there was a meeting set up. My dad went and met this. The only way I could explain to Americans is like going to have a meeting with Bin Laden or, you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So my dad goes in, he was fearless, and he goes in and has a meeting and he said, "Do you have a problem with the Mormons?" And this leader said no. And my dad said, "Okay then, can you leave us alone?" And he said, he was told that the word would be put out that we would be left alone, and we were left alone.
Wow.
So
all of these things from your perspective and then me listening to it sounds like very much like the fortitude that was instilled in the pioneers, that when you suffer for a cause and you sacrifice for a cause, it makes your devotion to the cause so much stronger. And that's the background for what's going to happen in your life in the future and why it takes on the complexion that it did. It's very different than a lot of people. And your brothers, now we know, I mean, geez, when you're a kid or a teen and you go in with dad and there's a bomb in the building, you're like, okay, I'm all in, right? So teenage dumb, high school, how was that?
So I'm going to go to age 11 first because that's
Going
a little
to
bit...
11, that's why I'm being in the topics, you're keeping the cadence.
No,
We're at 11 now.
No, I'm going to explain why to you. So what they do in the UK is they do what's called academic selection. They don't do it here. So when you're 11, they take all the kids in and they test them.
Okay.
And the kids that are kind of in the test off the top, they skim them off and take them to different schools, which is called a grammar school. The kids that don't score in that tier, they go to what's called a high school. So this is where I think my life and my brother's lives started to get a little bit different. So my three brothers, they went to what was called a regular high school. So they stayed kind of out in the countryside where we were. Things were a little bit, I don't know, like more protected or so. So I did this test when I was 11 and I got an A, and I was now going into the city to what's called a grammar school. And so then my life took a big kind of change from theirs. Do you know what I'm saying?
Totally.
So then I ended up going to a school that really they prepped people for law, medicine, accountancy, kind of those A-tier kind of careers. And you could either get in because you'd passed this exam, or if your parents were wealthy, they could pay to have you put in. So now my whole world opened up. I kind of left the countryside, took the bus in every day and went to this other school. And like everybody that I went to school with, their parents were like surgeons, and it was a completely different world to this kind of little quiet world I lived in the country. So now my friends and things that I were exposed to was just different to my brothers.
That makes a lot of sense. So I don't know if you know Plato's Republic, he recommended that system of
academic
glean
selection.
And put the top up to be the benevolent, righteous leaders and put the rest in the field. And that's fascinating. I wish they kind of do that here. I would have been a field worker from the get-go. So you are now 11, and from that point, you stay in the grammar school system, so to speak?
Yeah, so if you go to high school, you go for 5 years. If you go to grammar school, you go for 7 years, because you do different exams that push you into university and you can move over if there are some kids that do move over, but typically they call
Do they move backward? Do they ever go from grammar back to high school?
Not really, but the odd exception.
So it's like the celestial kingdom. You can advance up maybe, but you never go backwards. All right, so you're in the celestial kingdom world of high school. What were you about? We always ask that. What were you about as a kid, teenager? Obedient, rebellious, questioning?
When I got there, I was really So even when you get there were 5 classes and they tier you based on your ability and what your headmaster has said.
Fascinating.
So everybody's now ranked, you're like, what class are you in? What class are you in? So I got there and I was smart and I was in now this top class.
Whoa.
But the difference was I'd come from a different home background, where my home background, the whole emphasis was on religion, nothing else. My friends, there were 5 of us that were like best friends. 3 of them had gone to private school, and they're coming in from a completely different place and a different mindset, and parents, different occupations. And so when I got there, I think there was a lot expected of me, and I just wanted to socialize and have a good time and have fun, and just I don't think that I had any kind of educational support at home where other people had. I had no steering, and so because I didn't, and I kind of didn't know what to do with it, I just kind of went for the social side.
So you did the social side, graduate from grammar school, 7 years of it.
Yeah. They don't. It's not called graduation. So you do exams.
It's not called. I'm sorry. The jokester side of me is like listening to this. What's it called? Enlightenment. You've arrived. I mean, what did they call it?
Well, you do exams. You do exams when you're 16, and if you pass those well enough, you get to stay on for the final 2 years.
Oh.
If you do those, then you do exams that get you into university.
Oh, okay.
So
did you stay on?
I did.
You did?
Yes.
So at university time, did you take those exams to get in?
Yes, but I had actually left when I was 16, and my brother was in San Diego, and I came out to see him, and then I went. My other brother was in Utah, and I came to stay with him, and I was going to go to BYU at 16, and I just had a really hard time here. I just didn't fit in at all. So I ended up I don't think this is for me. So I went home and did the final 2 years. But on a little side note, I had a boyfriend for a year and a half at the school. And I remember one night we went for a walk, and you talk silly stuff.
There's a lot of walking.
There was nothing to do.
Everyone goes for walks.
There was nothing to do. We went for a walk one night, and silly kids talks about getting married, and I just said, so matter of fact, well, I could only ever be married in the temple, sealed in the temple, blah 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 blah. So really nice, good kid. And anyway, I was the only member of my church in the whole school. He starts taking the discussions, blah, 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 joins the church, and ends up going on a mission.
Wow.
Responsible. Yeah.
Just to jump ahead, do you regret that when you say responsible?
We've had conversations.
Could it have benefited his life?
To not meet me?
No, to have met you and joined the church.
But he did.
No, did it benefit his? Do you think it benefited him, or do you think it was detrimental? Do you regret having brought him into the church, or do you think maybe it was a blessing to him?
I think he would have been successful had he not. So yeah, I think he came from a really good family. I think he would have been, yeah.
Okay.
I think, yeah, I mean, yeah.
So going on to college, how did that look?
So
you came back, you did the 2 years.
So I came back, I did the 2 years, and then I had, which is not very common there, it's called a non-conditional offer, which means it didn't matter if you passed your exams or not, the school wanted you. So I had a non-conditional offer for art college. I really loved oil painting. That was kind of my thing, like abstract painting. So that summer that I finished, 2 months before I finished my final exams, there was a sister missionary who came into our branch, Sister Nielson, and she was from Utah, and her parents had sent her a pair of really nice leather boots, and she opened the box, and there were 2 left feet in there. So she knew that we were going to Utah for the summer because my second brother, he was getting his master's degree from BYU. So if we would take these boots out in the summer, her family would exchange them, and then I could bring them back. So we had these boots. I finished my exams on the Friday. I was in Utah by the next Wednesday. She gave me a number to call her family. So I called this guy and I'm like, "Hi, Sean, my name's Iilona." And he said, "I'm not Sean, I'm Shane." And this guy came to collect the boots the next weekend. So I finished my exams the one Friday. This guy comes to collect the boots the next Friday out in Utah. And what's your next question?
Out of two left boots,
Yes.
we have a marriage. Now tell us about, how long, I mean, Shane is sitting here on the front row of our interview smiling. So what happens here? You meet Shane and what do you do? Does romance bloom?
Well,
I love these stories.
I can only kind of,
She's looking at her paper now as if she doesn't remember.
I just like,
Let's see what happened when I met Shane.
so this is the honest truth. I had this other boyfriend who I dated for a year and a half, and we kind of had this plan. And so
He's not the one who, okay, we have another guy.
So he came to collect the boots. I opened the door and I was kind of really hoping that I wouldn't like him because I didn't want any temptation because I like this other boy. And I opened the door and I looked at him like, "Yep, we're all good. No temptation, not interested." So,
Really?
oh yeah.
That handsome guy? It was just nothing there.
No. So the good part about
that grammar education, it did nothing for her taste. Keep going.
So the good part about that was if you're attracted to someone, you can be a wee bit awkward and kind of nervous around them and you're not sure what to say and you're guarded. So I was going to stay for the weekend at his family's house and got into the car and I'm like, "Yep, this is totally fine, easy breezy," just started chatting. And then that was kind of, because there was no like awkwardness, it just kind of flowed, you know?
Real relationship can begin to bloom.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so did it? How long were you in the U.S. and in Utah?
So I was here for 6 weeks and I thought this is like a wee summer romance. You read about it in a book. I'll never see him again. I have my plans. I'm going to university. So I went home after 6 weeks and him and his friend had planned to backpack around Europe. So they came over to Europe. They were in France and they got a ferry, which is, a boat, right? Mm-hmm. To come to Ireland. I'm just making sure.
I understood that.
There's not too many ferries in America, are there, right?
There are a few.
All right.
Well, there's a lot. It just depends on which way you're looking at it.
So him and his friend got on the ferry, went from the south of France to the south of Ireland, came up to see me, and it wasn't very convenient because I still had this boyfriend, so they came for the weekend, and I thought, well, this is kind of okay, but I'll never see this guy again, right? Because he's 4,000 miles away. So they stayed for the weekend, they left, they went back down to Southern Ireland, got on a ferry to go back to France. And according to him, his story is when, this was back before the euro, when every European country had its own currency. And he had, he'd lived in Germany, he'd lived in France, Luxembourg, Belgium. So he was good with languages, he was good with currency. So when the boat or the ferry was about to leave the harbor, he said he just had this feeling to get off the boat. And he was like, "No, this is crazy. We've just started this trip. We've planned it for a long time." He had the feeling again, didn't do anything with it. And then they called to say, right, that's it. They were going to pull up the, what's that thing they pull up?
Anchor?
Well, no, not the anchor, like the thing that you walk across. The ramp. The ramp.
Oh, okay.
So they're saying, so that was it. And so he said he just got up. He had all these different currencies in his pockets. He just emptied his pockets, put all the currency on the table and said to his friend, "I'm going back to get her." And got off the boat.
We are talking about big romance here. Wow, I'm going back to get her. That is awesome. That's really great. So did he?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. So how old are you then?
Right now?
No, how old are you then?
Oh, that's been the question of the week.
Right now?
I was 19.
19, and Shane was?
So he was 23 then.
23.
Yeah.
And had he, when you met him on the 6-week sojourn to return the boots, was he active LDS?
Oh, very much so, yeah. He had been on his mission, eldest of 7, big, large family, pioneer stock.
Wow. So all those boxes ticked. All right. And he's 23. So he's ready for marriage. He's home from the mission. How long did it take from the return of the ferry to your house to go back and get you? That is a bold, strong move. Hats off to Shane. Good move, Shane. Yeah. I'm going back to get her. So how long did it take before you married? And was it in the temple? Not that it matters, but is there a temple over there for you to be married in? Okay. So what'd you do?
So he came back. There was no way back to Derry that night. So I think he had to find like a youth hostel or something and stay there, and got a bus up the next day. Was a wee bit awkward again because I still had a boyfriend. Now I had like 2. What was I going to do? So he was kind of super mature, and he just said, well, I know what I want. Let the best man win, and I'm just going to stay in this and see how it goes.
Wow.
So he kind of came back and forth every 6 weeks to see me. And it was 10 months from the time we met to the time we got married.
Wow.
And honestly, it probably would have been longer, but it was so expensive. You know, you come back to where it was about £1 a minute on the phone.
Yeah.
There was no texting or anything like that.
So you marry and you begin your life as a couple, LDS, active, of course. He was, you are. It's full forward, and we have 10 minutes left for you to bring us up where you and Shane but we can continue on the next hour. But you and Shane are raising family, you're building your home, your relationship, things like that. Take us up to, if you can.
I can't, because I have something really important I need to tell you.
Well, let's hear it.
Okay, so I got endowed 2 days before we were getting married.
Okay.
Got married on the Thursday, I got endowed on the Tuesday. After the endowment, we were driving up through the canyon and going home, and I just had this massive flashback. So growing up, my grandfather, the original one who joined the church, they ended up leaving the church big time, and he became a massive Mason.
Wow.
I believe he was the Grand Master in our city. I'm not sure, but that's what I heard growing up. So my uncle lived in the Masonic Lodge and took care of it. It was a massive building. And my cousins, I had 3 boy cousins. They weren't the cousins you saw all the time, but I saw them a few times, and we had a few sleepovers. So when we knew we weren't supposed to, but we did anyway, when the adults were away, we would sneak down into the actual Masonic Lodge, the room where they did everything. And we play hide and seek. And, you know, we didn't really touch anything or interfere with anything, but we definitely saw things. And I think that's one of the massive differences maybe between things that I was exposed to as a child to maybe someone grown up in a very Mormon family here. So this day that I got endowed, we're in the car driving home, and all of a sudden these memories that I had forgotten about that were 10 years before, I just freaked out. I said,
don't stop right there.
All right.
Endowed, for those of you who don't know, in Mormon nomenclature is when you go through the Mormon temple and you receive the rites and rituals that cause you or have you wear their garments as a covenant that you make in there. So there's all kinds of signals and signs. And what Iilona is saying is that when she went through and got endowed before getting married, she saw similarities between what she saw in the Masonic temple playing hide and seek as a kid to the endowment time. Carry on.
Absolutely. So my Mormon prep just didn't exist. I mean, I didn't come from a big bustling stake or ward or anything. And I was just sitting in the car and I was like, oh my gosh, like I have seen this all before. I have seen their aprons. I've seen the compass. They have the chairs are set out the same. The like the thrones, the altar. And so this is 2 days before I'm getting married. And I just said, we have all been brainwashed. Like, this isn't new and original. This was my playground, you know, as a child. And I just didn't know what to do. Seeds
planted. God plants in people. He's planting. So is Shane next to you driving while you're having this experience?
Yeah.
Do you tell him?
Oh, why? He's the recipient of my,
of your every word?
Of my fluster, yeah.
And what's he saying?
I think he was trying to settle me down, but I was so kind of distraught at what it's like my eyes were open and I had joined all these dots, and I was in such a bad way that there was an emergency phone call to the stake president, who I got in to see that night to try and settle me down.
Wow. Now you guys don't understand. This is a great way to lead us into the next hour. Is this stuff is connected. She's not making it up. Duncan's Book of Freemasonry, I challenge everyone to read that book because it gives you what she saw. It tells you, it shows you the pictures, everything. And it was written in 1790 and it was the Scottish Rite.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about she's experiencing this. I never knew this about you. Mm-hmm. I never knew you had that in you first. Mm-hmm. This is fantastic. Mm-hmm. So you meet with the stake president. Did any of it, did it just say, okay, I'm okay? Did it make sense to you? Did you let your own wishes make it be true?
I felt under a lot of pressure because my parents had traveled out to America.
Oh my gosh.
And even my ex-boyfriend who'd gone on a mission, even his parents had come to America for the wedding. Like I had these people and everybody's ready and good to go. And now I felt like it's like the game like Jenga or whatever. You can pull out the one thing and the whole thing collapses. And there's just all this pressure. And he's the eldest of 7 and the firstborn son and the first to get married. And everybody's now just thinking this is fantastic. And inside I'm like, I am just panicking.
Yeah, and panicking about the church, not Shane, the church.
Yes. And another thing was I knew I'd heard enough conversation, like you're never told anything directly, but I would have gone to school with a lot of sons of Masons, very high up Masons, because the business was all very connected. And so I had known from going to school that within my city, if you'd gone for a job interview, regardless of how you performed, at the end of the interview, you would be given a handshake by the interviewer. If you give the right handshake, was a good chance you would get the job. And guess what? I had been exposed to that day.
Wow. Amazing. When she says guess, she's talking about handshakes. When you go in the Mormon temple, there's a veil put up and you're taught these different handshakes, which are very similar to Masonic handshakes. And you give them as signs and tokens in order for you to be accepted into this next realm, a celestial realm, which was very big in Scottish Masonry. So this girl is putting it all together, and it must have been absolutely shocking, devastating, but the pressure's on. We're going to leave it there. Join us next week because this story now starts to get really interesting, because now you're going to hear how this all culminates. She's married now with a husband, and they have success and they have children, beautiful family, and on and on and on. And then where does this stuff come home to roost? Join us next week here on Heart of the Matter.